3 stages, which is described in the case concerning maritime delimitation in the Black Sea, Romania versus Ukraine. In the first stage, the Court will establish the provisional equidistance line from the most appropriate base points on the coasts of the parties. The Court will, in the second stage, consider whether there are factors calling for the adjustment or shifting of the provisional equidistance line in order to achieve an equitable result. In the third and final stage, the Court will submit the envisaged delimitation line, either the equidistance line or the adjusted line, to the disproportionality test. The purpose of this test is to assure the Court that there is no marked disproportion between the ratio of the lengths of the relevant coasts of the parties and the ratio of their respective shares of the parties in the relevant area to be delimited by the envisaged line, and thus to confirm that the delimitation achieves an equitable solution as required by the Convention. The Court observes that the 3-stage methodology is not prescribed by the Convention and therefore is not mandatory. It has been developed by the Court in its jurisprudence on maritime delimitation as part of its effort to arrive at an equitable solution as required by Articles 74 and 83 of the Convention. The methodology is based on objective geographical criteria, while at the same time taking into account any relevant circumstances bearing on the equitableness of the maritime boundary. As the overlap of the maritime projections of the coast of Kenya and the coast of Somalia. The Court considers it appropriate to use the overlap of the 200 nautical mile radial projections from the land boundary terminus. As far as the southern limit of the relevant area is concerned, the Court notes that the parties agree that the maritime space south of the boundary that Kenya and Tanzania, south of the boundary between Kenya and Tanzania is not part of the relevant area. The relevant area, as identified by the Court for the purpose of limiting the exclusive economic zone and continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles from the coast, measures approximately 212,844 square kilometers. The Court next constructs the provisional equidistance line. It first identifies the base points it considers appropriate for the construction of the provisional equidistance line within 200 nautical miles of the coasts. The provisional equidistance line is constructed on the basis of these base points, and it begins from the endpoint of the maritime boundary in the territorial sea, point A, and continues until it reaches 200 nautical miles from the starting point of the maritime boundary, at a point with the coordinates indicated in the judgment. The resulting line is depicted on sketch map 9, which is now shown on the screen. The Court next considers whether there are factors requiring the adjustment or shifting of the provisional equidistance line in order to achieve an equitable solution. The Court recalls that Kenya perceives the provisional equidistance line as inequitable, while Somalia does not see any plausible reason for adjusting the line and believes that it would constitute an equitable boundary. The court notes that Kenya, by invoking various factors which it considers as constituting relevant circumstances in the context of this case, has consistently sought a maritime boundary that would follow the parallel of latitude. The court has already concluded that no maritime boundary between Somalia and Kenya following the parallel of latitude was established in the past. Nor has the court accepted the methodology based on the parallel of latitude for establishing the maritime boundary between the parties as advocated by Kenya. Kenya would now like to achieve the same result by a major shifting of the provisional equidistance line, changing its southeasterly direction to an exclusively easterly direction. The court considers that such a shifting of the provisional equidistance line, as argued for by Kenya, would result in a radical adjustment while clearly not achieving an equitable solution. It would severely curtail Somalia's entitlements to the continental shelf and exclusive economic zone generated by its coast adjacent to that of Kenya. A line thus adjusted would not allow the coast of the parties to produce their effects in terms of maritime entitlements in a reasonable and mutually balanced way. The court begins by considering those factors relied on by Kenya, which are of a non-geographical nature. As far as the security interests of Kenya are concerned, the court is fully aware of and does not underestimate the serious threats to security in the region. These threats are certainly of legitimate concern to the states of the region and to the international community at large. The court notes the efforts of the international community, in particular the United Nations and the African Union, as well as of various countries including Kenya, to assist Somalia in reestablishing peace and security after many years of internal conflicts. The court observes that boundaries between states, including maritime boundaries, are aimed at providing permanency and stability. That being so, the court believes that the current security situation in Somalia and the maritime spaces adjacent to its coast is not of a permanent nature. The court is therefore not of the view that the current security situation justifies an adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. Moreover, the court recalls its statement in a previous case that legitimate security considerations may be a relevant circumstance if a maritime delimitation was effected particularly near the coast of a state. This is not the case here, as the provisional equidistance line does not pass near the coast of Kenya. The court also recalls that control over the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelf is not normally associated with security considerations and does not affect the rights of navigation. Access for Kenya's fisherfolk to natural resources is another factor which Kenya brings to the attention of the court when arguing for the adjustment of the line. Such a factor can be taken into account by the court as a relevant circumstance in exceptional cases, in particular if the line would likely entail catastrophic repercussions for the livelihood and economic well-being of the population of the countries concerned. On the basis of the evidence before it, the court is not convinced that the provisional equidistance line would entail such harsh consequences for the population of Kenya in the present case. In any event, as it appears from a map provided by Kenya, 17 out of 19 fish landing sites are located near or at the Lamu archipelago and would therefore be unaffected by an equidistance line. Only 2 landing sites are close to the land boundary terminus. Moreover, in the present case, the court has to consider the well-being of the populations on both sides of the delimitation line. In light of the foregoing, the court cannot accept Kenya's argument that a provisional equidistance line would deny Kenya equitable access to fisheries resources that are vital to its population. The court then turns to Kenya's argument that the parties' long-standing and consistent conduct in relation to oil concessions, naval patrols, fishing, and other activities reflects the existence of a de facto maritime boundary along the parallel of latitude, which calls for adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. The court has already concluded that no maritime boundary along the parallel of latitude has been agreed by the parties. There is no de facto maritime boundary between Somalia and Kenya. The court therefore cannot accept the argument of Kenya that, on the basis of conduct of the parties, the provisional equidistance line has to be adjusted so that it coincides with the alleged de facto maritime boundary. The court next considers the 2 remaining arguments that, according to Kenya, call for adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. Kenya submits that the application of an equidistance line would produce a significant cutoff effect with respect to its maritime areas. It also points out that the cutoff effect produced by the equidistance line is severely exacerbated past the 200 nautical mile limit, essentially to the point that Kenya would be completely cut off from the outer limit of the continental shelf. Kenya further argues that the regional context and practice require the adjustment of the provisional equidistance line. The court and international tribunals have acknowledged that the use of the equidistance line can produce a cutoff effect, particularly where the coastline is characterized by concavity. In 1985, the court reaffirmed that an equidistance line may yield a disproportionate result where a coast is markedly concave or convex. The International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, while stating that in the delimitation of exclusive economic zone and continental shelf concavity is not necessarily a relevant circumstance, has also confirmed that when an equidistance line drawn between two states produces a cutoff effect on the maritime entitlement of one of the two states as a result of the concavity of the coast, then an adjustment of that line may be necessary in order to reach an equitable result. The court considers that any cutoff effect as a result of the Kenya maritime boundary is not a relevant circumstance. The agreements between Kenya and Tanzania are res inter aelios actos. They cannot per se affect the maritime boundary between Kenya and Somalia. However, the issue to be considered in the present case is whether the use of an equidistance line produces a cutoff effect for Kenya, not as a result of the agreed boundary between Kenya and Tanzania, but as a result of the configuration of the coastline. If the examination of the coastline is limited only to the coasts of Kenya and Somalia, any concavity is not conspicuous. However, by examining only the coastlines of the two states concerned to assess the extent of any cutoff effect resulting from the geographic configuration of the coastline may be an overly narrow approach. Examining the concavity of the coastline in a broader geographical configuration is consistent with the approach taken by this court and international tribunals. In the two North Sea continental shelf cases, the court examined the coasts of 3 states with Germany in the middle. The court did so in the context of proceedings that had been joined, although the cases themselves remained separate. The court noted that although 2 separate delimitations were in question, they involved, indeed actually gave rise to, a single situation. The court emphasized that the fact that the question of either of these delimitations might have arisen and called for settlement separately in point of time does not alter the character of the problem with which the court is actually faced. In both the Bangladesh-Myanmar and Bangladesh versus India cases, even though the issue was that of a boundary between the 2 respective states, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea in the former case and the Arbitral Tribunal in the latter each looked at the concavity of the coast of the 3 states as a whole, with Bangladesh in the middle. In the present case, the potential cutoff of Kenya's maritime entitlements should be assessed in a broader geographical context. The potential cutoff of Kenya's maritime entitlements cannot be properly observed by examining the coasts of Kenya and Somalia in isolation. When the mainland coasts of Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania are observed together as a whole, the coastline is undoubtedly concave. Kenya faces a cutoff of its maritime entitlements as the middle state located between Somalia and Tanzania. The presence of Pemba Island, a large and populated island that appertains to Tanzania, accentuates this cutoff effect because of its influence on the course of a hypothetical equidistance line between Kenya and Tanzania, as shown by sketch map number 10, now appearing on the screen. The provisional equidistance line between Somalia and Kenya progressively narrows the coastal projection of Kenya, substantially reducing its maritime entitlements within 200 nautical miles. This cutoff effect occurs as a result of the configuration of the coastline extending from Somalia to Tanzania, independently of the boundary line agreed between Kenya and Tanzania, which in fact mitigates that effect in the south, in the exclusive economic zone and on the continental shelf up to 200 nautical miles. The court recalls its jurisprudence and that of international tribunals, according to which an adjustment of the provisional equidistance line is warranted if the cutoff effect is serious or significant. In the view of the court, even though the cutoff effect in the present case is less pronounced than in some other cases, it is nonetheless still serious enough to warrant some adjustment to address the substantial narrowing of Kenya's potential entitlements. The Court has affirmed that the achievement of an equitable solution requires that, so far as possible, the line of delimitation should allow the coasts of the parties to produce their effects in terms of maritime entitlements in a reasonable and mutually balanced way. This is an important standard to be used in making an adjustment to the provisional equidistance line. The Court, however, bears in mind the following principles. There is no question of refashioning geography or compensating for the inequalities of nature. Equity does not necessarily apply equality, and there can be no question of distributive justice. In other words, an adjustment should not produce an unreasonable result for Somalia. In order to attenuate the cutoff effect described earlier, the Court considers it reasonable to adjust the provisional equidistance line. In view of the above considerations, the Court believes that it is necessary to shift the line to the north so that from point A it follows a geodetic line with an initial azimuth of 114 degrees. This line would attenuate in a reasonable and mutually balanced way the cutoff effect produced by the unadjusted equidistance line due to the geographic configuration of the coasts of Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania. The resulting line would end at its intersection with the 200 nautical mile limit from the coast of Kenya at a point B, with the coordinates indicated in paragraph 174 of the judgment. The adjusted line is depicted in sketch map number 11, now appearing on screen. In the final stage, the Court checks whether the envisaged delimitation line leads to a significant disproportionality between the ratio of the lengths of the parties' respective relevant coasts and the ratio of the size of the relevant area apportioned by the line. As mentioned earlier, the relevant coast of Somalia is 733 kilometers, and that of Kenya is 511 kilometers long. The ratio of the relevant coasts is 1 to 1.43 in favor of Somalia. The maritime boundary determined by the Court divides the relevant area within 200 nautical miles of the coast in such a way that approximately 120,455 square kilometers would appertain to Kenya, and the remaining part, measuring approximately 92,389 square kilometers, would appertain to Somalia. The ratio between the maritime zones that would appertain respectively to Kenya and Somalia is 1 to 1.3 in favor of Kenya. A comparison of these two ratios does not reveal any significant or marked disproportionality. The Court is thus satisfied that the adjusted line that it has established as the maritime boundary for the exclusive economic zone and the continental shelves of Somalia and Kenya within 200 nautical miles in the Indian Ocean described earlier achieves an equitable solution as required by Article 74, Paragraph 1 and Article 83, Paragraph 1 of the Convention. The Court finally turns to the question of the delimitation of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. It is recalled that both parties have asked the Court to determine the complete course of the maritime boundary between them, including the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. The Court recalls that any claim of continental shelf rights beyond 200 nautical miles by a state party to UNCLOS must be in accordance with Article 76 of UNCLOS and reviewed by the Commission on the limits of the continental shelf established thereunder. The Court observes that both states have made submissions on the limits of the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles to the Commission in accordance with Article 76, Paragraph 8 of the Convention. The Court notes that both Somalia and Kenya have fulfilled their obligations under Article 76 of the Convention. At the same time, the Commission has yet to consider these submissions and make any recommendations to Somalia and Kenya on matters related to the establishment of the outer limits of their continental shelves. It is only after such recommendations are made that Somalia and Kenya can establish final and binding outer limits of their continental shelves in accordance with Article 76, Paragraph 8 of UNCLOS. The Court emphasizes that the lack of delineation of the outer limit of the continental shelf is not, in and of itself, an impediment to the delimitation between two states with adjacent coasts, as is the case here. The Court observes that the entitlement of the parties to the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles are to be determined by reference to the outer limit of the continental margin, to be ascertained in accordance with Article 76, Paragraphs 4 and 5 of UNCLOS. The entitlement of a state to the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles depends on geological and geomorphological criteria subject to the constraints set out in Article 76, Paragraph 5. An essential step in any delimitation is to determine whether there are entitlements and whether they overlap. The situation in the